So, welcome back to the den, guys. Sorry I didn't quite describe it well last time. I'm doing this all off script and just reading as I go. Yeah, just ideas if you'd like. Wouldn't mind them. I'm gonna get right to it here in a sec. Forgot to pop out the stream. Stream chat so that I can do this, minimize this, pull this up, and see what you guys are doing. If any of you dare pop in. Do you dare? I don't know. Anyway. Chapter 2. Rain drummed steadily, drearily, on the walls of Alan Holt's broken down tower. The Holt's single guest room was never very bright, and, though it was only mid-afternoon, Jenny had summoned a dim ball of bluish witch-fire to illuminate the table on which she had spread the contents of her medicine satchel. The rest of the little cubbyhole was curtained in shadow. In the bed, Gareth dozed restlessly. The air was sweet with the ghosts of the long-dried fragrances of crushed herbs. The witchlight threw fine, close-grained shadows around the desiccated mummies of root and pod where they lay in the circles Jenny's had traced. Slowly, rune by rune, she worked the healing spells over them, each with its own limitation, to prevent a too quick healing that might harm the body as a whole. Her fingers patiently tracing the signs, her mind's calling down the qualities of the universe particular to each. Like separate threads of unheard music, it was said that the great mages could see the power of the runes they wrought glowing like cold fire in the air above healing powders, and sense the touch of it like plasmic light drawn from the fingertips. After long years of solitary meditation, Jenny had come to accept that for her, magic was a depth and a stillness rather than the moving brilliance it was for the great. It was something she could never quite become reconciled to, but at least it kept her from the resentment that would block what powers she did have. Within her narrow bounds, she knew she worked well. The key to magic is magic, Carradine had said. To be a mage, you must be a mage. There's no time for anything else, if you will come to the fullness of your power. So she had remained in the stone house on Frostfell after Carradine had died, studying his books and measuring the stars, meditating in the crumbling circle of ancient standing stones that stood on the hill crest above. Through the slow years, her powers had grown with steady meditation and study, though never to what his had been. It was a life that had contented her. She had looked no further than the patient striving to increase her powers, while she healed others where she could and observed the turnings of the seasons. Then John had come. The spells circled to their conclusion. For a time silence hung on the air, as if every hearth brick and rafter shadow, the fragrance of the applewood fire and the guttural trickle of the rain, had been preserved in amber for 1,000 years. Jenny swept the spelled powders together in a bowl and raised her eyes. Gareth was watching her fearfully from the dark shadows of the curtained bed. She got to her feet. As she moved toward him, he recoiled, his white face drawn with accusation and loathing. You are his mistress. Jenny stopped, hearing the hatred in that weak voice. She said, yes, but it has nothing to do with you. He turned his face away, fretful and still half dreaming. You're just like her, he muttered faintly. Just like Cyrene. She stepped forward again, not certain she had heard clearly. Who? You've sneered him with your spells, brought him down into the mud, the boy whispered, and broke off with a feverish sob. Disregarding his repulsion, she came worried to his side, feeling his face and hands. After a moment, he ceased his feeble resistance, already sinking back to sleep. His flesh felt neither hot nor overly chilled. His pulse was steady and strong. But still he tossed and murmured, I never will. Spells, you have laid spells on him, made him love you with your witcheries. His eyelids slipped closed. Jenny sighed and straightened up, looking into this flushed, troubled face. If only I had laid spells on him, she murmured, then I could release us both, had I the courage. She dusted her hands on her skirt and descended the narrow darkness of the turret stair. She found John in his study, what would have been a fair-sized room had it not been jammed to overflowing with books. For the most part, these were ancient volumes, left at the hold by the departing armies or scavenged from the cellars of the burned-out garrison towns of the south. Rat-chewed, black with mildew, unreadable with water stains, they crammed every shelf of the labyrinth of planks that filled 2 walls, and they spilled off to litter the long oak table and heaped the floor in the corners. Sheets of notes were interleaved amongst the pages, and between their covers, copied out by John in the winter's evenings. Among and between them were jumbled at random the tools of a scribe, prickers and quills, knives and inkpots, pumice stones, and stranger things beside, metal tubes and tongs, plumb bombs and levels, burning glass and pendulums, magnets, the blown shells of vases, chips of rock, dried flowers, and a half-disassembled clock. A vast spider web of hoists and pulleys occupied the rafters in one corner, and battalions of guttered and decaying candles angled along the edges of every shelf and sill. The room was a magpie nest of picked at knowledge, the lair of a tinkerer to whom the universe was one vast toy shop of intriguing side issues. Above the hearth, like a giant iron pine cone, hung the tail knob of the Dragon of Weir, 15 inches long and 9 through, covered with stumpy, broken spikes. John himself stood beside the window, gazing through the thick glass of its much-mended casement out over the barren lands to the north, where they merged with the bruised and tumbled sky. His hand was pressed to his side, where the rain throbbed in the ribs that the tail knob had cracked. Through the soft buckskin of her boots, though the soft buckskin of her boots made no sound on the rutted stone of the floor, he looked up as she came in. His eyes smiled greeting into hers. She only leaned her shoulder against the stone of the doorpost, and asked, "Well?" He glanced, sealing word where Gareth would be laying. "What? Our little hero and his dragon?" A smile flicked the corners of his thin, sensitive mouth, then finished like the swift sunlight of a cloudy day. "I've slain one dragon, Jen, and bloody ne'er finished me. Tempting as the promise is of getting more fine ballads written of my deeds, I think I'll pass this chance." Relief and the sudden recollection of Gareth's ballad made Jenny giggle as she came into the room. The whitish light of the windows caught in every crease of John's leather sleeves as he stepped forward to meet her and bent to kiss her lips. Our hero never rode all the way north by himself, surely. Jenny shook her head. "He told me he took a ship from the south to Elvsbach and rode east from there." He's got lucky he made it that far, John remarked, and then kissed her a bit, his hands warm against her sides. The pigs had been restless all day, carrying bits of straw about in their mouths. Turned back yesterday even from riding the bounds because of the way the crows were acting out on the wind hills. It's 2 weeks early for them, but it's in my mind that this will be the first of winter storms. The rocks at Eldgrow are ship-eaters, you know. Dotus says in Volume 3 of his Histories, or is that part of Volume 5 we found in Ember? Or is it in Clivy? That there used to be a mole or breakwater across the harbor there, back in the days of the kings. It was one of the wonders of the world, Dotus or Clivy says, but nowhere can I find any mention of the engineering of it. One of these days I'm minded to take a boat out there and see what I can find underwater at the harbor mouth. Ginny shuddered, knowing John to be perfectly capable of undertaking such an investigation. She had still not forgotten the stone house he had blown up after reading some moldering account about the gnomes using blasting power to tunnel in their deck deeps, nor his experiment with water pipes. Sudden commotion sounded in the dark of the turret stair, treble voices arguing, "She is too," and "Let go." A muted scuffle ensued, and a moment later a red-haired, sturdy urchin of 4 and so exploded into the room in a swirl of grubby sheepskin and plaids, followed immediately by a slender, dark-haired boy of 8. Jenny smiled and held out her arms to them both. They flung themselves against her. Small, filthy hands clutched delightedly at her hair, her skirt, and the sleeves of her shift, and she felt again a surge of ridiculous and illogical delight at being in their presence. "And how are my little barbarians?" she asked in her coolest voice, which fooled neither of them. "Good, we've been good, Mama," the older boy said, clinging to the faded blue cloth of her skirt. "I've been good. Adric hasn't." "Have too," retorted the younger one, whom John had lifted into his arms. "Papa had to whip Ian." "Did he now?" She smiled down into her older son's heavy-lidded and into her older son's eyes, heavy-lidded and tip-tilted like John's, but as summer blue as her own. "He doubtless deserved it, with a big whip," Adric amplified, carried away with his tale. 100 cuts. "Really?" She looked over at John with a matter-of-fact inquiry in her expression. "All in one session, or did he rest in between?" "One session," John replied serenely, "and he never begged for mercy even once." "Good boy." She ruffled Ian's coarse black hair, and he twisted and giggled with pleasure at the solemn make-believe. The boys had long ago accepted the fact that Jenny did not live at the Hold, as other boys' mothers lived with their fathers. The Lord of the Hold and the Witch of the Frostfell did not have to behave like other adults. Like puppies who tolerate a kennel and the keeper's superintendence, the boys displayed a dutiful affection towards John's stout Aunt Jane, who cared for them and, she believed, kept them out of trouble while John was away looking after the lands in his charge, and Ginny lived apart in her own house on the fell, pursuing the solitudes of her art. But it was their father they recognized as their master, and their mother as their love. They started to tell her, an excited and not very coherent duet, about a fox they had trapped, when a sound on the doorway made them turn. Gareth stood there, looking pale and tired, but dressed in his own clothes again, bandages making an ungainly lump under the sleeve of his spare shirt. He dug an unbroken pair of spectacles from his baggage as well, behind the thick lenses. His eyes were filled with sour distaste and bitter disillusions as he looked at her and her sons. It was as if the fact that John and she had become lovers, that she had borne John's sons, had not only cheapened his erstwhile hero in his eyes, but had made her responsible for all those other disappointments that he had encountered in the Winterlands as well. The boys sensed at once his disapprobation. Adric's pugilish little jaw began to come forward in a miniature version of John's, but Ian, more sensitive, only signaled to his brother with his eyes. The two of them took their silent leave. John watched them go, when his gaze turned speculative to Gareth, but all he had to say was, "So you live, then?" Rather shakily, Gareth replied, "Yes, thank you." He turned to Jenny with a forced politeness that no amount of animosity could uproot for his courtier soul. "Thank you for helping me." He took a step into the room and stopped again, staring blankly about him as he saw the place for the first time. Not something from a ballad, Jenny thought, amused in spite of herself, but then no ballad could ever prepare anyone for John. Big crowded, my dad used to keep the books that had been left at Allen Hold in the storeroom with the corn, and the rats had accounted for most of them before I'd learned to read. I thought they'd be safer here. Gareth said at a loss. I suppose. He was a stiff-necked old villain, my dad, John went on conversationally, coming to stand beside the hearth and extend his hands to the fire. If it hadn't been for Carden, who was about on the hold on and off when I was a lad, I'd never have got past the alphabet. Dad hadn't much use for written things. I'd found half of the inactive Lucard's fire-giver posted over the cracks in the walls of the cupboard my granddad used to store winter clothes in. I could have gone out there and thrown rocks at his grave, I was that furious, but because, of course, there's none of the play to be found now. God knows what they did with the rest of it. Kindled kitchen stoves, I expect. What we managed to save isn't much. Volumes 3 and 4 of Dodius' history, most of Polybus's Analects and his jurisprudence, the Elucidus Lapidaris, Clivy's on farming, in its entirety for all that's worth, though it's pretty useless. I don't think Clivy was much of a farmer, or even bothered to talk to farmers. He says you can tell the coming of storms by taking measurements of the cloud and their shadows, but the grannies around the villages say you can just tell watching the bees, and when he talks about the mating habits of pigs. I warn you, Gareth, Jenny said with a smile, that John is a walking encyclopedia of old wives' tale, granny rhymes, snippets of every classical writer he can lay his hands upon, and trivia gleaned from the far corners of the hollow earth. Encourage him at your peril. He also can't cook. I can, though, John shot back at her with a grin. Gareth, still gazing about him in mystification at the cluttered room, said nothing, but his narrow face was a study of mental gymnastics as he strove to adjust the ballard's conventionalized catalogue of perfections with the reality of a bespectacled amateur engineer who collected lore about pigs. "So then," John went on in a friendly voice, "tell us of this dragon of yours, Gareth of Maglashaden, and why the king sent a boy of your years to carry his messages when he's got warriors and knights that could do the job as well." Gareth looked completely taken aback for a moment. Messengers in ballad never be asked for their credentials. That's just it. He hasn't got warriors and knights. None, not that can be spared, and I came because I knew where to look for you, from the ballads. He fished from the pouch his gold belt a gold signet ring, whose bezel flashed in a sport of yellow earthlight. Jenny glimpsed a crowned king upon it, seated between 12 stars. John looked in silence at it for a moment, then bent his head drew the ring to his lip with archaic reverence. Jenny watched his action in silence. The king was the king, she thought. It was nearly 100 years since he withdrew his troops from the north, leaving that to the barbarians and the chaos of lands without law. Yet, John still regarded him as the subject of the king. It was something she herself had never understood. Either John's loyalty to the king, whose laws he still fought to uphold, or Carradon's sense of bitter and personal betrayal by those same kings. To Jenny, the king was the ruler of another land, another time. She herself was a citizen only of the Winterlands. Bright and small, the gold oval of the ring flashed as Gareth laid it upon the table, like a witness to all that was said. He gave that to me when he sent me to seek you, he told them. The king's champions all rode out against the dragon, and none of them returned. No one in the realm has ever slain a dragon, nor even seen one up close to know how to stack it, really. And there is nothing to tell us. I know, I've looked, because it was the one useful thing I could do. I know I'm not a knight, or a champion. His voice stumbled a little on the admission, breaking the armor of his formality. I know I'm no good at sports, but I've studied all the ballads and all their variants, and no ballad really tells all that much about the actual how-to of killing a dragon. We needs a Dragonsbane, he concluded helplessly. We need someone who knows what he's doing. We need your help. And we need yours. The light timbre of Averson's smoky voice suddenly hardened it to flint. We've needed your help for 100 years. While this part of the realm from the river to Dragonsbane north was laid waste by bandits and ice riders and wolves and worse things. Things we haven't the knowledge anymore to deal with. Marsh devils and whisperers and the evils that haunt the night woods. And that's evils that steal the blood and souls of the living. Has your king thought of that? It's a bit late in the day for him to be asking favors of us. The boy stared at him, stunned. But the dragon. Pox blister your dragon. Your king has 100 knights and my people only have me. The light slid across the lenses of his specs in a flash of gold as he turned his broad shoulders against the blackened stones of the chimney breast. The spikes of the dragon's tail knot gleaming evilly beside his head. Gnomes never have just one entrance to their deeps. Couldn't your king's knights have gotten the surviving gnomes to guide them through a secondary entrance to take things from behind? Visibly nonplussed by the heroic practicality of the suggestion, Gareth blundered. I don't think they could have. The rear entrance of the deep is in the fortress of Halnath. The master of Halnath, Polycarp, the king's nephew, rose in revolt against the king not long before the dragon's coming. The citadel is under siege. Silent, in the corner of the hearth to which she had retreated, Jenny heard the sudden shift of the boy's voice, like the sound of a weakened foundation giving under strain. Looking up, she saw his two prominent Adam's apple throb as he swallowed. There was some wound there, she guessed to herself, some memory still tender to the touch. That's the one reason so few of the king's champions could be spared. It wasn't only the dragon, you see. He leaned forward pleadingly. The whole realm is in danger from the rebels as well as the dragon. The deep tunnels into the face of the Nast Wall, the great mountain ridge that divides the lowlands of Belle Marie from the northeastern marshes. The citadel of Halnath stands on a cliff on the other side of the mountain from the main gates of the deep, with the town and the university below it. The gnomes of Yedfordun were our allies against the rebels, but now most of them have gone over to the Halnath side. The whole realm is split. You must come. As long as the dragons and Yelf are done, we can't keep the roads from the mountains properly guarded against the rebels, or send supplies to the besiegers of the citadel. The king's champions went out. He swallowed again, his voice tightening with the memory. The men who brought back the bodies said that most of them not even got a chance to draw their swords. Ah! Averson looked away, anger and pity twisting his sensitive mouth. Any fool would take a sword after a dragon in the first place. But they didn't know. All they had to go on were the songs. Averson said nothing to this, but judging by his compressed lips and the flare of his nostrils, his thoughts were not pleasant ones. Gazing into the fire, Jenny heard his silence, and something like the chill shadow of a wind-driven cloud passed over her heart. Half against her will, she saw images form in the molten amber of the fire's heart. She recognized the winter-colored sky above the gully, charred and brittle spears of poisoned grass fine as needle scratches against it. John, standing posed on the gully's rim, the barbed steel rod of a harpoon in one glowing hand, gloved hand, and an axe gleaming on his belt. Something rippled in the gully, a living carpet of golden knives. Clearer than the sharp, small ghosts of the past she saw was the shiv-twist memory of fear, as she saw him jump. They had been lovers then for less than a year, still burningly conscious of one another's body, when he had sought the dragon's lair. More than anything else, Jenny had been aware of the fragility of flesh and bone when it was pitted against steel and fire. She shut her eyes. When she opened them again, the silken pictures were gone from the flame. She pressed her lips taut, forcing herself to listen without speaking, knowing it was and could not be none of her affair. She could no more have told him not to go, not then, not now, than he could have told her to leave the stone house on Frost Fell and give up her seeking, to come to the hold to cook his meals and raise his sons. John was saying, "Tell me about this, Drake." "You mean you'll come?" The forlorn eagerness in Gareth's voice made Jenny want to get up and box his ears. "I mean I want to hear about it." The Dragonsbane came round the table and slouched into one of the room's big carved chairs, sliding the other in Gareth's direction with a shove of his booted foot. "How long ago did it strike?" "It came by night, 2 weeks ago. I took the ship 3 days later from Clyketh harbor below the city of Bell. A ship is waiting for us at Eldsbach. I doubt that." John scratched the side of his long nose with one scarred fingers. "If your mariners were smart, they'll have turned and run for the safe port 2 days ago. The storms are coming. Eldsbach will be no protection to them. But they said they'd stay." Gareth protested indignantly. "I paid them. Gold will do them no good weighing their bones to the bottom of the cove." John paid them. Gareth sunk back into his chair, shocked, cut to the heart by this final betrayal. They can't have gone. There was a moment's silence when John looked down at his hands. Without lifting her eyes from the heart of the fire, Jenny said softly, "They are not there, Gareth. I see the sea, and it is black with storms. I see the old harbor at Eldsbach, the grey river running through the broken houses there. I see the fisher folk making fast their little boats to the ruins of the old piers, and all the stones shining under the rain. There is no ship there, Gareth." "You're wrong," he said hopelessly. "You have to be wrong." He turned back to John. "It'll take us weeks to get back, traveling over land." "Us!" John said softly, and Gareth blushed and looked frightened as if he had uttered a mortal insult. After a moment, John went on. How big is this dragon of yours? Gareth swallowed again as drew his breath in a shaky sigh. Huge, he said dully. How huge? Gareth hesitated. Like most people, he had no eye for relative size. It must have been 100 feet long. They say the shadow of its wings covered the whole of the deeping veil. Who says? John inquired, shifting his weight sideways in the chair and hooking a knee over the fornicating sea lions that made up the left-hand arm. I thought it came by night, bunched up anybody close enough to see it by day. Well, he floundered in a sea of third-hand rumor. Ever seen it on the ground? Gareth blushed and shook his head. It's kind of hard to judge things in the air, John said kindly, pushed up his specs again. The drake I slew here looked about 100 feet long in the air when I first saw it descending on the village of Great Toby. Turned out to be 27 feet from beak to tail. Again, his quick grin illuminated his usual expressionless face. It comes of being a naturalist. The first thing we did, Jenny and I, when I was on my feet again after killing it, was go out there with cleavers and see how the thing was put together, what there was left of it. It could be bigger, though, couldn't it? Gareth asked. He sounded a little worried, as if, Jenny thought dryly, he considered 27-foot dragons somewhat paltry. I mean, in the Greenhearth variant of the Lay of the Salcather, Dragonsbane and the worm of the impertinent wood, they said the worm was 60 feet long, with wings that could cover a battalion. Anybody measure it? Well, they must have, except now that I come to think of it, according to that variant, Salcather had wounded onto it death, and the dragon fell into the river Wildspade, and a later Balmauri version said it fell into the sea. So I don't think anyone could have, or how anyone could have. So a 60-foot dragon is just somebody's measure of how great Salcather was. He leaned back in his chair, his hands absent-mindedly tracing over the lunatic carvings, the mingled shapes of all the creatures of the Book of Beasts. The worn gilding still caught in the chinks dulled with the dull sheen and the stray glints of the fire. 27 feet doesn't sound like a lot. Still, it's there spitting fire at you. You know their flesh will decompose almost as soon as they die. It's as if their own fire consumes them, as it does everything else. Spitting fire. All the songs say they breathe it. They sort of spit it. It's liquid fire. Nearly anything it will touch it. Nearly anything it touches will catch. That's the trick in fighting a dragon, you see. To stay close enough to its body that it won't spit fire at you for fear it's burning itself, and it will not get rolled on or cut to pieces with its scales whilst you're about it. They can raise the scales along their sides like a blowfish bristling, with their edge like razors. I never knew that, Gareth breathed. Wonder and curiosity lessened for a moment the shell of his offended dignity and pride. Well, the pity of it is, probably the king's champions didn't either. God knows I didn't when I went after the dragon in the gorge. There was nothing about it in any book I could find. Tortoises, Clivian them, only a few granny rhymes that mentioned dragons, or drake and worms as they're called. And they weren't much help. Things like cock by its feet, horse by its hame, snake by its head, drake by its name. Or what Polybus had in his analytics about certain villages, believing if you planted love seed, those creeper things with purple trumpet flowers on them around your house, dragons won't come near. Jenny and I used bits of that lore. Jen brewed poison from the love seed to put on my heart prunes, because it's obvious in the face of that no fiddling little sword was going to cut through those scales. And the poison did slow the thing down, but I didn't know near as much about them as I'd like. No. Jenny turned her eyes from the fire's throbbing core, rested her cheek upon her hand where it lay on her updrawn knees, regarding the two men on the other side of the book-cluttered table. She spoke softly, half to herself. We know not where they come from, nor where they breed. Why, of all the beasts of the earth, they have 6 limbs instead of 4. Maggots from meat, quoted Johns. Weevils from rye, dragons from stars and an empty sky. That's in terms of ghosts, or if Cowardens save a dragon, slave a dragon. Or why they say you should never look into a dragon's eye. And I'll tell you, Gar, I was careful not to do that. We don't even know simple things, like why magic and illusion won't work on them. Why Jen couldn't call the dragon's image in that jewel of hers or use a cloaking spell against his notice. Nothing. Nothing, Jenny said, save how they died, slayed by men as ignorant of them as we. John must have heard the strange sorrow that underlay her voice, for she felt his glance, worried and questioning. She turned her eyes away, not knowing the answers to what he asked. After a moment, John sighed, said to Gareth, "It's all the knowledge that's been lost over the years, like Lukejar's fire river and how they managed to build a breakwater across the harbor mouth at Eldbach. Knowledge that's been lost and may never be recovered." He got to his feet, began to pace restlessly, the flat, whitish-gray reflections from the window winking on spike and mail scrap of the brass of dagger hilt and buckle. We're living in a decaying world, Gar. Things are slipping wet day by day. Even you, down south in Bell, you're losing the realm one piece at a time. With the winter lands tearing off in one direction, the rebels pulling away in the marches of another. You're losing what you had and don't even know it, and all that while knowledge is leaking out the seams like meal being from a ripped bag, because there isn't time or leisure to save it. I would have never slain the dragon, Gar. Slay it when we knew nothing about it, and it was beautiful in itself. Maybe the most beautiful thing I'd ever laid eyes on. Every color of it perfect at sunset, like a barley field in certain lights you get on summer evenings. But you have to slay ours. There was a sudden agony in Garrett's voice. Fighting it and slaying it are 2 different things. John turned back from the window, his head dipped slightly to one side, regarding the boy's anxious face. And I haven't yet said I'd undertake the one, let alone accomplish the other. But you have to. The voice was a forlorn whisper of despair. You're our only hope. Am I? The Dragonsbane asked gently. I'm the only hope of all these villagers coming through the coming winter against wolves and bandits. It was because I was their only hope that I slew the most perfect creature I've ever slain. Slew it dirtily, filthily, chopping it to pieces with an axe. It was because I was their only hope that I fought it at all, and near had my flesh shredded from my bones by it. I'm only a man, Gareth. No, the boy insisted desperately. You're the Dragonsbane, the only Dragonsbane. He rose to his feet, some inner struggle playing upon his thin features, his breathing fast, as if forcing himself to some exertion. The king, he swallowed hard. The king told me to make whatever terms I could to bring you south. If you come, with an effort he made his voice steady. If you come, we would send troops again to protect the Northlands, to defend them against the Ice Riders. We will send books and scholars to bring knowledge to the people again. I swear it. He took it up, the king's seal, and held it in his trembling palm, and the cold daylight flashed palely across his face. In the king's name I swear it. But Jenny, watching the boy's white face as he spoke, saw that he did not meet John's eye. As the night came on, the rain increased, the wind throwing it like sea breakers against the walls of the hold. John's Aunt Jane brought up a cold supper of meat and cheese and beer, which Gareth picked at with the air of one doing his duty. Jenny, sitting cross-legged in the corner of the hearth, unwrapped her hearth and experimented with its tuning pegs, while the men spoke of the roads that led south and of the slaying of the golden dragon of Weir. That's another thing that wasn't like the songs, Gareth said, resting his bony elbows amidst the clatter of John's notes on the table. In the songs, the dragons are all gay-colored, gaudy, but this one is black, dead black, all over save for the silver lamps of its eyes. Black, John repeated quietly, and looked over at Jenny. You had an old list, didn't you, love? She nodded, her hands resting in the delicate maneuverings of the harp pegs. Gareth had me memorize many old lists, he explained to Gareth. Some of them he told me the meaning of. This one he never did. Perhaps he didn't know himself. It was names and colors. She closed her eyes, repeating the list, her voice falling into the old man's sing-song chant, the echo of dozens of voices back through the length of years. Teltravir heliotrope, Centivir's blue knotted with gold. Asterith, his primrose and black, Morkaleb alone, black as night. The list goes on. There were dozens of names, if names they are. She shrugged and linked her fingers over the curve of the harp's back. But the John tells me that the old dragon that was supposed to haunt the shores of Lake Wiver in the east was said to have been blue as the waters, marked all over his back with patterns of gold so that he could lie beneath the surface of the lake in the summer and steal sheep from the banks. Yes, Gareth almost bounced out of his chair with enthusiasm as he recognized the familiar tale. In the warm of Reaver was slain by Antara War Lady and her brother Darthus Dragonsbane. In the last part of the reign of Yvain the Well-Beloved, who was... He caught himself up again, suddenly embarrassed. It's a popular tale, he concluded, red-faced. Jenny hid her smile at the abrupt checking of his ebullience. There was notes for the harp as well, not tunes really. He whistled to me over and over until I got them right. She put her harp to her shoulder, a small instrument that had also been Kjardan's, though he had not played it. The wood was darkened, almost black with age. By daylight it appeared perfectly unadorned, but when firelight glanced across it, as it did now, the circles of the air and sea were sometimes visible, traced upon it in faded gold. Carefully she picked at those strange, sweet knots of sound, sometimes 2 or 3 notes only, sometimes a string of them, like a truncated air. They were individual in turns of their timing, hauntingly half-familiar, like things remembered from childhood. And as she played, she repeated the names. Teltravir, heliotrope, Centivir's blue knotted with gold. It was part of the lost knowledge, like that from John's scatterbrained jackdaw nest, and a small portion of his time not taken up with the brutal demands of the Winterlands. Notes and words were meaningless now, like a line from a lost ballad, or a few torn pages from the tragedy of an exiled god, pasted to keep wind from a crack, the echo of songs that would not be heard again. From them her hands moved on, random as her passing thoughts. She sketched vagrant airs or snatches of jigs and reels, slowed and touched with the shadow of an inevitable grief that waited in the hidden darkness of future time. Through them she moved to the ancient tunes that held the timeless pull of the ocean. in their cadences, sorrows that drew the heart from the body, or joys that called the soul from the distant glitter of stardust banners in the summer night. In time, John took from its place in the hole by the hearth a 10-penny whistle, such as children paid in the streets, and joyed its thin, bright music to hers, dancing around the shadowed beauty of the harp like a 1,000-year-old child. Music answered music, joining into a spell circle that banished, for a time, the strange tingle of fear and grief and dragon fire in Ginny's heart. Whatever come to pass, this was what they were not, and had now. She tossed back the cloudy streams of her hair and caught the bright flickers of Averson's eye behind his thick spectacles, the penny whistle luring the harp out of its sadness, and into dance airs wild as hay harvest winds. As the evening deepened and the hold folk drifted up to the study to join them, sitting where they could on the floor and the hearth, or in the deep embrasures of the windows, John's Aunt Jane and Cousin Dilly and others of the vast tribe of females relatives who lived at the hold, Ian and Adric, the fat jovial Smith Muffle, all parts of the patterns of the life of the Winterlands that was so dull seeming at first, but was in truth close woven and complex in its random plays. Among them Gareth sat, ill at ease as a bright southern parrot in a rookery. He kept looking about him with puzzled distaste in the leaping restless of the red firelight that threw into momentary brightness the moldering rummage of decaying books, of rocks and chemical experiments, that glowed in the children's eyes and made amber mirrors of the dogs, wondering, John thought, how a quest as glorious as his could possibly have ended in such a place. And every now and then she noticed his eyes return to John. There was in them not only anxiety, but a kind of nervous dread, as if he was haunted by a growing guilt for something he had done, or something he knew he must yet do. Will you go? Jenny asked softly, much later in the night, lying in the warm nest of bearskins and patchwork, with her dark hair scattered like sea wrack over John's breast and arm. If I slay his dragon for him, the king will have to listen to me, John said reasonably. If I come at his calling, I must be his subject, and if I am, we are, his subjects. As king, he owes us the protection of his troops. If I am not his subject, he paused as he thought over what his next words would mean about the law of the realm for which he had so long fought. He sighed and let the thought go. For a time, the silence was broken only by the groan of wind in the tower overhead and the drumming of the rain on the walls. But even had she not been able to see, cat-like in the dark, Jenny knew John did not sleep. There was tension in all his muscles, and the uneasy knowledge of how narrow had been the margin between living and dying when he fought the golden dragon of Weir. Her hand under his back could still feel the hard ridges of scar. Jenny, he said at last, my father told me that his dad used to be able to raise 400 and 500 of militia when the Ice Riders came. They fought pitched battles on the edge of the northern ocean and marched in force to break the strongholds of the bandit kings that used to cover the eastward winds. When that band of brigands attacked Far West Riding the year before last, do you remember how many men we could come up with, the mayor of Riding, the mayor of Toby, and myself among us? Less than 100, and 12 of those we lost in that fight. As he moved his head, the banked glow of the hearth on the other side of the other small sanctum of the bedchamber caught a thread of carnelian from the shoulder-length mop of his hair. Jin, we can't go on like this. You know we can't. We're weakening all the time. The lands of the King's Law, the law that keeps the strong from enslaving the weaker, are shrinking away. Every time a farm is wiped out by wolves, brigands, or ice riders, it's one less shield in the wall. Every time some family ups and goes south to indenture themselves as serfs there, always provided they make it that far, it weakens those of us that are left. The law itself is waning, as fewer and fewer people even know why there is law. Do you realize that because I've read a handful of volumes of Dotus and whatever pages of Polybius's jurisprudence I could find stuck in the cracks of the tower, I'm accounted a scholar? We need the help of the king, Jin, if we're not to be feeding on one another within a generation. I can buy them that help. With what? Asked Jenny softly. The flesh off your bones. If you are killed by the dragon, what of your people then? Beneath her cheek, she felt his shoulder move. I could be killed by wolves or bandits next week. Come to that, I could pull off old Osprey and break my neck. And when she chuckled, unexpectedly amused at that, he added in an aggrieved voice, It's exactly what my father did. Your father knew no better than to ride drunk. She smiled a little in spite of herself. I wonder what he would have made of our young hero. John laughed in the darkness. God, he'd have eaten him for breakfast. 17 years, 10 of which had been spent knowing Jenny, had finally given him a tolerance of the man he'd grown up hating. Then he drew her closer, kissed her hair. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet. I have to do it, John. Jin, I won't be gone long. A particularly fierce gust of wind shivered in the tower's ancient bones, and Jenny drew the worn softness of quilts and furs up over her bare shoulders. A month, perhaps, she calculated, maybe a little more. It would give her a chance to catch up on her neglected meditations, to pursue the studies that she too often put aside these days, to come to the Hold to be with him and their sons. To be a mage, you must be a mage, Carradine had said. Magic is the only key to magic. She knew she was not the mage that he had been, even when she had known him first, when he was in his 80s and she was a skinny, wretched, ugly girl of 14. She sometimes wondered whether it was because he had been so old, at the end of his strength when he came to teach her, the last of his pupils, or because she simply was not very good. Lying awake in the darkness, listening to the wind, or to the terrible greatness of the moor's silence, which was worse, she sometimes admitted the truth to herself, that what she gave to John, what she found more and more giving to those two little boys snuggled together like puppies upstairs, she took from the strength of her power. All that she had to divide between her magic and her love was time. In a few years she would be 40. For 10 years she had scattered her time, sowing it broadcast like a farmer in summer sunshine, instead of hoarding it and pouring it back into meditation and magic. She moved her head on John's shoulder, and the warmth of their long friendship was in the tightening of his arm around her. Had she forgone this, she wondered, would she be as powerful as Carradine had once been? As powerful she sometimes felt she could be when she meditated among the stones on her lonely hill. She would have that time, with her mind undistracted, time to work and strive and study. The snow would be deep by the time John returned. If he returned. The shadow of the Dragon of Weir seemed to cover her again, blotting the sky as it swooped down like a hawk over the autumn dance floor at Great Toby. The sickening jarrum of her heart in her throat came back to her as John ran forward under that descending shadow. trying to reach the terrified gaggle of children cowering in the center of the floor. The metallic stink of spat fire seemed to burn again in her nostrils, the screams echoing in her ears. 27 feet, John had said. What it meant was that from the top of the dragon's shoulder to the ground was the height of a man's shoulder, and half again to the top of its tail haunches. Half again that to the top of its tail haunches, backed by all that weight and strength and speed. And for no good reason she could think of, she remembered the sudden shift of the boy Garrett's eyes. After a long time of silence, she said, "John, I want to go with you when you ride south." She felt the hardening of the muscles of his body. It was nearly a full minute before he answered her. She could hear in his voice the struggle between what he wanted and what he thought might be best. "You said yourself it would be a bad winter, love. Thinking one or the other of us should be here." He was right, she knew it. Even the coats of her cats were thick this fall. A month ago she'd been troubled to see how the birds were departing, early and swiftly, anxious to be gone. The signs pointed to famine and sleet, and on the heels of those would come barbarian raids from across the ice-locked northern sea. And yet, she thought, was this the weakness of a woman who did not want to be parted from the man she loves, or was it something else? Carradine would have said that love clouded the instincts of a mage. "I think I should go with you. You think I can't handle the dragon myself?" His voice was filled with mock indignation. "Yes," Jenny said bluntly, and felt the ribs vibrate under her hand with his laughter. "I don't know what circumstances you'll be meeting it," she went on, "and there's more than that." His voice was suddenly thoughtful in the darkness, but not surprised. "It strikes you that way too, does it?" It was something people tended not to notice about John, between his facade of amiable barbarism, behind his frivolous fascination with hog lore, granny rhymes, and how clocks were made, lurked an agile mind and an almost feminine sensitivity to the nuances of situations and relationships. There was not much that he missed. "Our hero has spoken of rebellion and treachery in the south," she said. "If the dragon has come, it will ruin the harvest, and rising bread prices will make the situation worse. I think you'll need someone there whom you can trust." "I've been thinking it too," he replied softly. "Now, what makes you think I won't be able to trust our Gar? I doubt you'd betray me out of the queue once the goods aren't as advertised." Jenny rolled up onto her elbows, her dark hair hanging on a turn over his breast. "No," she said slowly, and tried to put her fingers on what troubled her most about that thin, earnest boy she had rescued in the ruins of the old town. At length she said, "My instincts tell me he can be trusted, at heart. But he's lying about something. I don't know what. I think I should go with you to the south." John smiled and drew her down to him again. "The last I went against your instincts, I was that sorry. Myself, I'm torn, for I can smell there's going to be danger here later in the winter. But I think you're right. I don't understand why the king would have given his word and his seal to the keeping of the likes of our young hero, whom, by the sound of it, has never done more than collect ballads in all his life, and not to some proven warrior. But if the king's pledged his word to aid us, then I'd be a fool not to take the chance to pledge mine. Just the fact that there's only the two of us, Jen, shows how close to the edge of the darkness all this land lies. Besides," he asked, sudden worry in his voice, "you've got to come." Her thoughts preoccupied by her nameless forebodings, Jenny turned her head quickly. What is it? Why? We'll need someone to do the cooking. With a cat's swift move, she was on top of him, smothering his face under a pillow. But she was laughing too much to hold him. They tussled, giggling, their struggles blending into lovemaking. Later, as they drifted in warm aftermath, Jenny murmured, You make me laugh at the strangest times. He kissed her then, and slept. But Jenny sank no further than an uneasy borderlands of hat dreams. She found herself standing once again on the lip of the gully, the heat from below beating at her face, the poison scouring her lungs. In the drifting vapors below, the great shape was still writhing, heaving its shredded wings, or clawing ineffectually with the stump of its forelegs at the small figure braced like an exhausted woodcover over its neck, a dripping axe in his blistered hands. She saw John moving mechanically, half asphyxiated with the fumes and swaying from the loss of the blood that gleamed stickily on his armor. The small stream in the gully was clotted and red with the dragon's blood. Gobbets of flesh choked it. The stones were blackened with the dragon's fire. The dragon kept raising his dripping head, trying to snap at John. Even in her dream, Jenny felt the air weighted with the strange sensation of singing, vibrant with the music beyond the grasp of their ears and mind. The singing grew stronger as she slid deeper into sleep. She saw against the darkness of a velvet sky the burning white disk of the full moon, the private omen of power. Before it slid the silver silk flash of membranous wings. She woke in the deep of the night. Rain thundered against the walls of the hold, a torrent roaring in the darkness. Beside her, John slept, and she saw in the darkness what she had noticed about morning and daylight, that for all his 34 years, he had a thread or two of silver in his unruly brown hair. A thought crossed her mind. She put it aside firmly, and just as firmly it re-intruded herself. It was not a daylight thought, but a nagging whisper that only comes in the dark hours. After troubled sleep, don't be a fool, she told herself. The times you have done it, you always wish you hadn't. But the thought, the temptation, would not go away. At length she rose, careful not to wake the man who slept at her side. She wrapped herself in John's worn, quilted robe and padded from the bedchamber, the worn floor like smooth ice beneath her small bare feet. The study was even darker than the bedchamber had been. The fire there nothing more than the glowing line of rose-colored heat above a snowbank of ash. Her shadow passed like the hand of a ghost over the slumbering shape of the harp, and made the silver of reflected red wink along the penny whistle's edge. At the far side of the study, she raised a heavy curtain and passed into a tiny room that was little more than a niche in the hold's thick wall, barely wider than its window. In daylight it was coolly bright, but now the heavy bull's-eye glass was black as ink, and the witchlight she called into being above her head glittered coldly on the rain streaming down outside. The phosphorescent glow that illuminated the room outlined the shape of a narrow table and 3 small shelves. They held things that belonged to the cold-eyed ice witch who had been John's mother, or to Keratin, simple things, a few bowls, an oddly shaped root, a few crystals like fragments of broken stars sent for mending. Pulling her robe more closely about her, Jenny took from its place a plain pottery bowl, so old that whatever designs had once been painted upon its outer surface had long since been rubbed away by the touching of mages' hands. She dipped it upon the stone vessel of water that stood in this corner, and set it upon the table, drawing up before it a small spindle-legged chair. For a time she only sat, Gazing down into the water, slips of foxfire danced upon its black surface. As she slowed her breathing, she became aware of every sound, from the roaring of the rain gusts against the tower walls to the smallest drip of the eaves. The worn tabletop was like cold glass under her fingertips. Her breath was cold against her own lips. For a time, she was aware of the small flaws and bubbles in the glaze of the bowl's inner surface. Then she sank deeper, watching the colors that seemed to swirl within the endless depths. She seemed to move down towards an absolute darkness, and the water was like ink, opaque, unforgiving. Gray mists rolled in the depths, then cleared, as if wind had driven them. She saw the darkness in a vast place pricked by starlight points of candle flame. An open space of black stone lay before her, smooth as oily water. Around it was a forest, not of trees, but of columns of stone. Some were thin as silk, others thicker than the most ancient of oaks, and over them swayed the shadow of the dancers on the open floor. Though the picture was silent, she could feel the rhythm to which they danced. Gnomes, she saw, their long arms brushing the floor as they bent, the vast cloudy manes of their pale hair catching rims of fire like a sunset seen through the heavy smoke. They danced around a misshapen stone altar, slow dances that are forbidden to the eyes of children of men. The dream changed. She beheld a desolation of charred, broken ruins beneath the dark flank of a tree-covered mountain. Night sky arched overhead, wind cleared and heart-piercingly beautiful. The waxing moon was like a glowing coin, its light touching with cold white fingers the broken pavement of the empty square below the hillside upon which she stood, edging the raw bones that moldered in puddles of faintly smoking slime. Something flashed in the velvet shadow of the mountain, and she saw the dragon. Starlight gleamed like oil on the lean, sable sides. The span of those enormous wings stretched for a moment, like a skeleton arms to embrace the moon's stern face. Music seemed to drift upon the night, a string of notes like truncated air, and for an instant her heart leaped towards that silent, dangerous beauty, lonely and graceful in the secret magic of its gliding flight. Then she saw another scene by the low light of a dying fire. She thought she was in the same place, on a rise overlooking the desolation of the ruined town before the gates of the deep. It was the cold hour of the tide's ebbing, some hours before John. John lay near the fire, blood leaking from the clawed rents in his armor. His fat face was a mess of blisters beneath a mask of gore and grime. He was alone, and the fire was dying. Its light caught a spangle of red from the twisted links of his torn mail shirt and glimmered stickily on the upturned palm of one blistered hand. The fire died. For only a moment, only starlight glittered on the pooling blood, and the outline, the shape of his nose and lips against the darkness. She was underground once more, the place where the gnomes had danced. It was empty now, but the hollow silences beneath the earth seemed filled with the inchoate murmur of formless sound, as if the stone altar whispered it to itself in the darkness. Then she only saw the small flaws in the gaze of the bowl, in the dark, oily surface of the water. The witchlight had long ago failed above her head, which ached as it often did when she had overstretched her power. Her body felt chilled through to the bones, but she was for a time too weary to move from where she sat. She stared before her into the darkness, listening to the steady drums of rain, hurting in her soul and wishing with all that was in her that she had not done what she had done. All divination was chancy, she had told herself, and water was the most notorious liar of all. There was no reason to believe what she had seen would come to pass. So she repeated herself over and over, but it did no good. In time, she lowered her face to her hands and wept. Alrighty. That's it, folks. I'll have a good one.